Manazar was the first permanent camp, and it opened in 1942, when our family arrived there in April. Now, America was at war with Italy and Germany also, but only Japanese-American families were rounded up and imprisoned in concentration camps. Now, why was this possible? How could this happen in America, land of freedom and equality? What were the factors that led to this? First was panic and fear. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, although 3,000 miles away in the Pacific, was the closest thing to invasion the United States had ever experienced. There was hysteria, great fear, and unfortunately, the newspapers and radio fed this fear with irresponsible journalism, fanning hatred and irrational response with intense propaganda. Remember, there was no television in those days. There were no investigative reporters interviewing elderly women and children filing into these desolate camps. But the press in those days could be inflammatory. And I put a lot of the blame of hysteria on their shoulders. The military was the first to propose removing the Japanese from the West Coast. They soon received authorization from President Roosevelt with Executive Order 9066, even though the head of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, claimed the Japanese were not a security threat. And in his mind, along with Attorney General Francis Biddle, thought that their judgment was that the Japanese immigrants were overwhelmingly loyal. But they were overruled by the Western War Command, headed by General John DeWitt. An Executive Order 9066 was put into action, but only against the Japanese. But a very powerful factor allowed this injustice to go forward and cannot be ignored, and that was racism. Since the Chinese immigrants first arrived in the 1840s to work in the mines and for the railroad, there had been intense anti-Asian feelings on the West Coast. This was more than 100 years ago, and at that time in California, there was a great labor shortage, and big companies looked to the east for workers. They weren't looking down south to Mexico. The first Asian arrivals were often seen as threatening simply because they looked different, were strangers, and spoke a different language. Soon after building railroads and providing the back-breaking labor for the development of the West Coast, they saved their money and began having businesses and buying land. They became economic competitors. Now, this economic threat spurred legislation to prevent Asians from owning land, and this is how it was accomplished. First, in 1911, a law was passed which prevented aliens or non-American citizens of Asian background from becoming citizens. Then 2 years later, in 1913, another law was passed denying ownership of land to non-citizens. Thus, my father, who came to this country in 1904, who contributed to its growth as a pioneer, could not become a citizen nor own land until 1952. That was the year I graduated from high school. Despite these racially imposed barriers, many families prospered. The Japanese were very successful farmers and fishermen, and by 1941 they controlled 40% of the truck farming business in California. But with the forced internment, most of these families lost their properties and businesses and dropped out of American society for an average of 3 years. Actually longer, because after the war was over and the camps closed, most preferred to slip back into their communities unnoticed. Still reeling from the massive displacement, there was fear of further racism. Rumors of lynchings, house burnings, and violence had swept through the camps. Jobs and housing were scarce. Most of the public were unaware of the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Nisei fighting unit that fought so valiantly in Europe, earning more Purple Hearts and medals than any other military group. They were young Japanese-American soldiers, some volunteers from Hawaii, and others drafted out of the camps, and some who proved their ultimate loyalty by sacrificing their lives. 35,000 Japanese-American men and women served in the armed forces during World War II. 2,500 in the Pacific Theater as military intelligence soldiers. Called MacArthur's secret weapon, their intelligence work is purported to have shortened the war in the Pacific by a year. Now, World War II took place more than 70 years ago, 1941 to 1945. Farewell to Manazar was written 30 years later, and since its publication in 1973, I have spoken to many, many groups about the internment experience. And always, 2 questions are asked. 1, why did it take so long to tell my story? Why 30 years after the event? And 2, do I think it could ever happen again in America? For many years, Manazar remained a dim memory, something the family rarely talked about. I used to think I dreamt those years in camp, and it wasn't until almost 30 years later that I revived those dreams and collaborated with my husband to write about them. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley, came to visit me in Santa Cruz. He was taking a sociology class, and for the first time in his life, outside of talk in the family, had heard the word Manzanar. Auntie, he said, you know, I was born in Manzanar, and I don't know anything about that place. Can you tell me something about it? His professor had pointed out the existence of camps, but that was all. Until then, Manzanar had seemed more a family myth than an actual fact to my nephew. Of course, I said, but why don't you ask your folks? I have, he said, but they seem reluctant, like I shouldn't be asking, or there's some skeleton in the closet I'm not supposed to know about. That's strange, I thought. Whenever our family talked about camp, which wasn't often, we joked about things, such as the lousy food, the dust storms, the communal showers, the baseball games. We talked lightheartedly about the outdoor movies and about the schools. So I proceeded to tell the same stories in the same superficial way, as if I was sharing some summer camp experience. My nephew looked at me intently, very quiet, and then said, Auntie, that's bizarre. You were locked up in a prison. How did you feel about that? For a moment I was stunned. He asked a question no one had ever asked before, a question I had never dared to ask myself. How did I feel? And for the first time in my life, I dropped the cover of humor and nonchalance and allowed myself to feel and I began to cry and I couldn't stop. My poor nephew was upset. What had he done to send his auntie into hysterics? I realized then why his parents were unable to tell him about Manzanar. At the time, I was auntie to 33 nieces and nephews. 7 had been born in camp, and I was certain none of them knew about their birthplace. I decided to write a memoir, a history, just for the family. But I found that whenever I tried to write, I would break down. So I turned to my husband, a writer, and who was then teaching at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and told him of my problem. "What memoir?" he asked. Now, Jim and I had been married 14 years at that time, and I had known him for 5 years before we married, and I had never told him about Manzanar. He knew of some, quote, camp in my background. When I did reveal my true feelings, he said, "This is not a story just for your family. It's a story everyone in America should know. Let's work on this together." Thus began a collaboration